Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part of the first 250 Looney Tunes series. This will be both on YouTube and as a podcast in audio form. Now, part 1 was about Bosco and the Merry Melodies over at the Harmonizing Studio. Part 2 was about the shaky beginnings of the Schlesinger Studio with, of course, Buddy, everyone's favourite character, of course. Now, part 3 was about the arrival of Tex Avery and Frank Tashlon's first stint. But now we start off with Bob Clampett, who, through a weird series of events, became a director who would end up becoming one of the most creative and certainly one of the most wildest directors in Looney Tunes history, in fact in all of animated history for that matter. So let's start off by taking a look at the earlier days of Bob Clampett. Now, I'll start off this time, as I wanted to explain how Clampett even became a director, which in itself is just crazy to think that if this chain of events didn't happen, we wouldn't have eventually ended up with some of the most amazing cartoons ever made. So, Clampett was in Tex Avery's unit along with Chuck Jones. Leon Schlesinger needed to have more shorts made for these to fill up the schedule, so he had Clampett and Jones, among others, to go to the iWorks studio. iWorks being Walt Disney's, former friend at the time, but they did reconnect later on, where they were going to make some Porky Pig shorts. Now, after the second Porky, iWorks basically just left, and after a few different things happening, he would eventually end up back with his old friend Walt Disney, and Clampett would direct a few shorts at the iWorks studio, and once those were done, he would come back to the Schlesinger studio and head his own unit. Chuck Jones would co-direct the first handful with Clampett before Clampett would direct on his own, and then, of course, when Tashlon left, Jones would take over Tashlon's unit. I mean, Clampett's career, to me, had a few phases, with the first being the films co-directed by Chuck Jones, then the films on his own where he was mostly forced to direct Porky shorts, and the last, perhaps most famous phase is when he did all those colour shorts in Tex Avery's old unit.
Alright, Bob Clampett. He is actually my favorite Looney Tunes director of this period. I know. How could you say that over Avery, Tashlon? I'm sorry. I don't know what it is. It has to do a little bit with how he characterizes Daffy and how his cartoons are usually animated in a different way than the other studios are doing. To me, I can look at a short and I could be like, yeah, that's a Clampett cartoon.
Well, when I was growing up, Bob Clampett was probably my favorite director. Only because I really loved Ren and Stimpy growing up, and I learned that Bob Clampett was a big influence on that. And his cartoons are just so unrestrained as far as the comedy goes. And I have mixed feelings about Clampett, admittedly, but I can't bring myself to say that I dislike him as a director, only because he has so much charm and energy and enthusiasm towards what he's doing that it really comes through in the stuff that he directed. He strikes me as someone who was born to make animated cartoons.
Bob. Oh, Bob. Oh, Bobby. You know, it's kind of funny. When I compare Bob's earlier efforts to his later stuff, while they're definitely not nowhere near as wacky as they would eventually get, you can tell how playful he was being with like these cute character designs. And I think like my personal favorite will always be Porky in Wacky Land, at least during this point, because of how energetic it was. But even stuff like Porky and Daffy and Get Rich Quick Porky and those stuff, they have like so much fun moments here and there with the individual characters. Like, who would have ever thought I would have felt sorry for a poor dog and a gopher and in a weird oily well? And even stuff like What Price Porky, like maybe not the best effort, but it's so much fun to see just how crazy he would go with all these different ducks and chickens and stuff.
So with Clampett, I could already tell that he wanted to be a director, because I know that he did character poses for Daffy's Duck Hunt and helped sort of write the cartoon. So you can definitely tell he had the energy to be one.
I'm a Clampett fan. I'm a major Clampett fan. I love Bob Clampett. once I went through the whole list, I was looking for what's the worst Clampett. I remember, and I determined in my mind what the worst one was. For me, it was the one called Nutty News, which I thought was the weakest Clampett cartoon that I could think of from the 40s. I think almost every other Clampett is great. And I mean, if Nutty News is the worst, I mean, everything else is fantastic.
Avery is very iconic, don't get me wrong, but some of my favorite cartoons from this period all come from Clampett. A lot of his Porkies are usually really good, even though I know Anthony didn't like it that much. I really do like the Daffy Doc. The concept of that is just hilarious in its own right, and I just wish they did more with that. Any short with Daffy and Porky is just gold. Porky and Daffy come to mind immediately, not just because it was the first commentary I did with Anthony on this channel. It's just such a funny one, and you know what? If it wasn't for Clampett, we probably wouldn't have had Woody Woodpecker or anything like that. And I think that's really important to know. I could go on and on, honestly.
His early stuff is really good, especially with Chuck Jones. The animation is terrific. You have like really rich story ideas.
You put the Looney in Looney Tunes, and he was like to me the looniest director. I love that there's such a difference between Clampett of the 40s and Tex Avery of the 40s. Two completely different takes. Their personalities are just 100% different, and yet they're both doing just great, stylish.
I feel like his art style would get a little tiresome at times, like compared to what he would do later on with the animators like Rod Scribner and Bob Kimson and Manny Gould and Bill Melendez. His earlier efforts, again, the drawings and animation are really good, but I kind of like his really earlier cartoons more with the much bigger eyes compared to the much tinier eyes he would do later on. They felt kind of bland to me, so to speak, which is funny because I consider if you've seen any of, I guess, controversial Count Screwloose cartoons at MGM, like, they feel like early Clampett cartoons with a slightly higher budget.
So my view on Clampett is that he started off with a bang, creating some of the very inventive shorts, even if the shorts themselves didn't have the best story structure. It was all gags first, in my opinion, with Clampett at the time. When Chuck Jones was on board, the shorts definitely felt more well-rounded, if perhaps maybe less funny than the shorts Clampett did when he was directing on his own. I did find that Clampett does get into a bit of a rut once he's settled in doing only Porky shorts.
Yeah, my only issue with Clampett, it's more later on, but sometimes it does get a little too out of control, and the animation does get a little all over the place at times, but he always strived to make entertaining cartoons, and he really succeeded in doing that.
The Bob Clampett Porkies will always be my guilty pleasures. It's the whole reason that I bought Porky 101. I like the cartoons he did with Chuck, like Hero Agency. But my all-time favorites are the ones he did by himself, like Porky in Egypt might be my favorite Looney Tunes ever. Porky's Tire Trouble, minus the intro cue. And Porky and Daffy, I really can't think of least favorites, but I guess Chicken Jitters isn't a laugh fest.
I mean, in terms of favourite Clampett, well, can anything beat Porky and Wacky Land? I mean, I certainly don't think so. I mean, some do come close, like Porky and Daffy and Porky's Tire Trouble, but definitely Porky and Wacky Land. It's one of the greatest cartoons ever made in history, full stop. This is Clampett finally unleashed from having to share directorial duties with Chuck Jones, but not that Chuck did bad things, of course. They made some great stuff together, but definitely Porky and Wacky Land.
Some of his best cartoons from this period, I think Porky and Wacky Land is probably the best cartoon he ever directed, in my opinion. Get Rich Quick Porky is really good. I saw that one a lot on public domain DVDs, the redrawn colorized version with the yellow dogs and the hot pink jackets and everything. What Price Porky? Yeah, and he does get into a rut with Porky Pig, but he's always trying. I appreciate with Clampett, he never phoned it in at all, and you gotta admire him for that.
Polar Pals, I really do like the animation in that one. And no, that is not what Canada looks like, I promise. I'm really excited to see the ones from the 40s when Anthony gets to those too. Final thoughts, Porky's Tire Trouble is also really great. So many great Clampett shorts from this period.
Porky and Wacky Lamb is probably a very good highlight, because of course it's one of his best, and that was his first one that he did without Chuck. Overall, I prefer him without Chuck because I felt that when he got out of Chuck, he sort of realized that he could go looser with how to do things. Overall, I definitely would say that I prefer him without Chuck, and that he made better pitches around that point. Though, of course, I do like the ones that he did with Chuck, like Porky and Daffy. And overall, I'd say that my least favorite ones were the ones that he begins doing where he off-centers Porky from the highlight, like Porky's 5 and 10, which just focuses around a bunch of fish antics, because when you're being forced to use a character, but then you don't use it, it sort of creates an awkward feeling in the cartoon, and overall that feeling doesn't work out for me. I would also have to say that the 2 cartoons he did at iWorks weren't as memorable, but definitely good starts for him, and that he really begins picking up his ground when he comes back to the studio to direct.
In terms of least favourite Clampett, I don't have anything specific to say about that. The thing about the Clampett's earlier efforts is that after a while he does get into a rut, as I mentioned before, where he'll just briefly introduce Porky and then just brush him aside from some other more interesting character he would have preferred to do. It's understood that Porky's were done because Schlesinger loved the character, so I guess it was just a way to please Schlesinger, while Clampett ended up doing his own thing. But least favourite, look, I really don't have a least favourite, but it's definitely him going through a bit of a rut, so most of his 1939 output would probably fall in that category for me.
Alright, so least favorite Clampetts. Now this is really tough because I really do like almost all the Clampett shorts. Ones that he had to do with Chuck Jones are probably some of the worst. Porky and Gabby and Porky's Super Service come to mind immediately. Because the thing about Clampett is that when he's allowed to do what he wants, he's great. But if he's held down by another director, and I feel like this is a usual case with animation directors, you can't have a co-director, in my opinion, only because they need to be able to work off their own, and I think that's important. So I would say that those are probably the worst. Engine Trouble, I could have said that, but that one has some really funny characters in it outside of the stereotypes.
Now, I asked Jerry Beck whether he preferred Clampett's earlier efforts with or without Chuck Jones, because I was curious to hear what he would have to say about that.
Well, I never really looked at it that way. I look at Clampett's cartoons as Clampett's cartoons, and I don't think about Chuck's involvement too much. Although one can see Chuck's involvement in the ones that he's involved with. Well, all I can say is I'm thinking of Clampett cartoons I like. You didn't mention Porky's Tire Trouble is one of my favorites. Is that is that one with Jones? I don't know.
No, it's not. No, that one's without Jones.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones without Jones would be probably my favorites too, based on the titles you've mentioned. Actually, I think that Jones, I think, did work on, and you tell me if I'm wrong or right, did he work on Porky's Hero Agency?
Yes.
I think that's got Chuck in it. Yeah. It's funny, I think you're right. I think the ones that are less, no, I'm sorry to say, I love Chuck Jones, so don't get me wrong, but I think you're right. I think the ones without Chuck are probably better. Chuck didn't work on Porky in Egypt, did he?
No, that was pure Clampett.
That goes perfectly with my theory. All right. So that's, all right. So maybe all the ones that we've mentioned that don't have Chuck are actually my favorites of that. But there's many great ones from that period. Chuck worked on, and again, I'm doing this off the top of my head without looking at credits or anything, but I'm looking at the artwork in my mind. But Chuck, I'm sure, would have worked on Porky's Papa, because I can see that the cow looks like a Chuck drawing, maybe. You know that one?
Yeah, he's in it. Yeah, that's with the mechanical cow that seems to be in a lot of cartoons at the time, like a mechanical.
I can't explain that. I know.
That's just.
In many ways, I do have a lot of respect for Bob early on, even if this isn't my personal favorite time period of him, even though, Porky and Wacky Land, personal favorite. But yeah, I mean, we got so much more cool stuff to see from Bob, and can't wait to see where it goes.
And now, on to some of the other directors. Now, unlike later in the Looney Tunes history, there were a whole bunch of other directors that are mostly forgotten today. And you can sort of see why once you note their output. Now, you've got Tom Palmer, who made the infamous Buddy's Day Out, and one other before he was dumped. And even Friz Freleng couldn't save Buddy's Day Out, as you may have seen. Earl Duval, He made a few early Buddy and Merry Melody shorts before being fired by Schlesinger during a drunken argument. Bernard Brown. He was the music director at the time, and he stepped in for a few shorts, possibly just to help out during the director shortage when Earl Duvall was fired. You had Jack King, the director who directed a lot of Buddy and early Porky shorts before going back to Disney, where he made, quite frankly, much better shorts. You had Ben Hardaway. He directed some shorts on his own, particularly the Buddy shorts, before leaving, and eventually he would return where he was teamed with Cal Dalton. And with Cal Dalton, we had also Cal Howard, and the two of them teamed up on 3 shorts before Cal Howard went to Miami to the Fleischer Studios, who had just moved there. And Cal Dalton, as I mentioned before, and he was a director who some have said was unfairly only teamed up with other directors and not given a chance to shine on his own. It definitely would have been interesting to see what he would have done on his own. But here are a few thoughts on the other directors by the Hobo Gadget Band.
Would Of Iwerks count? I don't know.
I'm biased. Ub was by no means a great director or anything, especially with the other cartoons he made outside of Disney, like Flip the Frog and Willy Whopper. But one thing I do like a lot about those cartoons is that they had a weird imagination that you would have never gotten at Disney, even if a lot of them were kind of, random stuff for the sake of it. Porky and Gabby and Porky's Super Service, they do have that similar mentality, and that might explain why Bob and Chuck ended up working on those cartoons, because allegedly they were responsible for finishing them up because they hated working on them, and they were basically brought over to actually get them done on time.
With King, I felt that his cartoons were promising at the beginning, but then overall, the more he continues directing, the more he loses his ground a bit, and that he overall generally begins producing some pretty bland cartoons towards the end of his Buddy unit. While he should have been able to have used Beans in a good way, he overall turns into another Buddy type character and just makes him another Mickey Mouse type character, but with a bit more of a tougher side, I would say, but without necessarily the character that made Mickey entertaining, despite Mickey probably being one of the characters with the least amount of character during this golden age.
I really don't have too many thoughts on those guys, honestly. Jack King, he would eventually become a really top-notch director at Disney with the Donald Duck cartoons, but I really don't know why he was lacking so much early on at Warner Brothers. Perhaps because especially when you consider that they had a lot more creative control at Warner Brothers than Disney. You could also argue that King didn't really have any idea what he was doing, and he was kind of winging it with those cartoons. But at the same time, like, some of them range from okay, such as Boom Boom and Shanghai Shipmates and so on and so forth, and then there's others that are just absolute garbage, like any of his buddy cartoons, Westward Woe, and what was that stupid cartoon called? A Cartoonist's Nightmare. Like, it's so weird that he would vary in quality, and he just never quite hit the mark. But fortunately, I guess by the time Tex could come around, he got his due and felt good to come back to Disney, because he always wanted to make cartoons in color, and he got that wish.
That with the Ham and X pairing, it could have turned out better, but because at that point Mischievous Children had been done too many times, they didn't really take advantage of how they could do it. With his Porkies, I like Boom Boom because Porky isn't necessarily the center of it, it's still supposed to be Beans, which generally means that there's a better push between it, but when he begins forced to use Porky, it overall begins turning into a bit of a mess, whereas then he begins just choosing whatever gag he can try to get, whether or not they're going to work, and he's still using these dynamic angles that I've mentioned around this time, but overall you don't really get much out of them because they're not being taken advantage of. He's just doing them for the sake of doing them. He goes back to Disney to go direct some good Donald Ducks where he gets what he needs. He gets some good writing, which works to his advantage, and he gets a way of more character out of being forced to use a character like Donald Duck, which definitely worked to his advantage.
Jack King, he was better off at Disney. a lot of his shorts here aren't that great, and when he got back to Disney and such, he was just much better.
Now, my view on the other directors, look, talk about a mixed bag. I mean, none of these directors are remembered much today, and it is for a very, very good reason. And that's not to say there's nothing of value in any of these directors' outputs, but a lot of them are definitely an acquired taste. Now, out of these directors, I would say Earl Duvall probably had the most potential, as all of his work at the studio, and yes, even his buddy shorts, are fun to watch. And Bernard Brown shorts are fun, although I personally suspect he didn't really direct per se. Then it was probably just the animators just putting something together, and he probably just fixed it all up in the end to make it at least watchable. And it shows. I mean, those shorts were definitely more loonier than some of the other shorts at this time. Now, Jack King, aside from directing Buddy's Bearcats, which, as I always say, I will defend until my dying breath, had probably the strangest outputs, filled with these very weird situations and just badly timed jokes. And I've always felt he was not really well fitted for this type of studio. He definitely, as I mentioned before, did better stuff over at the Walt Disney Studio on some of the Donald Duck shorts. And, you know, as for the Howard Dalton Hardaway thing that happened later on, look, very hit and miss. I don't think that they really gel together. Although I will say that the Howard Dalton team worked a little better than the Hardaway Dalton team, because it seemed like Hardaway was trying to overpower Dalton in those shorts, but that's just my opinion. And, you know, the less said about Tom Palmer, the better. I mean, the more I've researched about him, the more it's quite clear that he should not have directed it at all. So there you have it.
Jack King today gets a lot of flack for his time at Warner's. I think that's probably because of the many buddies he did. But I actually think he did better than when Freeling started out. I like some of his buddy cartoons, and A Cartoonist Nightmare and Boom Boom are among the best of the decade.
I don't really tend to like or appreciate the cartoons that came out of these other directors' work, because I feel that they didn't do enough for the evolution of the Warner cartoons overall to really be considered historic or memorable. Because around the same time that Ben Hardaway was making cartoons like Hobo Gadget Band, Bob Clampett and Tex Avery are pushing the envelope with what they can do with cartoons overall, and how they can make the Warner studio stand out among the rest of the Disney imitators of the time. And people like Jack King and Ben Hardaway, I feel, didn't get the memo. Well, not a literal memo, but you know what I mean. And they just kept on going along, like, imitating Disney. And I feel, for that reason, their cartoons really aren't very noteworthy. And I don't seem to like many, if any of them.
Ben Hardaway, see, I'm kind of a sucker for his shorts. They definitely aren't the most popular of the 1930s, but I really do like Bars and Stripes Forever and Harem Scarum, even though those are also co-directed mostly by Carl Dalton. I do like some of the shorts that Ben Hardaway did. Not all of them are winners, but, you know, he was a very hit-and-miss director, but when he hit pretty good. That's all I'll say on that.
When Hardaway was genuinely wanted to do a texted, but he only stuck with it. He sort of directed in a style that was for his freelance cartoons from 1936, which is an issue because he directed cartoons in 1938 and 39. So overall, you don't get a lot out of it, but you still get some clever stuff here and there, like Bars and Stripes Forever was definitely one of the ones that was very memorable because of some of the funnier gags in it, and because it works better as a Spock gag cartoon with a satisfying ending than his other directorial cartoons. Occasionally he could do some nice moments here and there, like in Busy Bakers. I like the song that Pinto Coving writes towards the beginning, and in Gold Rush Days there's some clever bits here and there, but it's overall not a very good one.
And as for Hardaway and Dalton, you know, they're good. They had their strengths and weaknesses for sure. Like Ben was better at gags, and you know Dalton was a really good animator. As directors, though, like to be as positive as possible, they worked well to an extent, but not every effort quite worked. Like, Gold Rush Days, it was a narrative cartoon without a proper, like, it was a bit too straightforward for its own good that it kind of missed the point of being funny. Whereas Bars and Stripes Forever, that one I consider like a personal favorite. It's really funny. But then, like, their other stuff, it just feels like they tried to imitate Tex Avery without quite understanding what made him work. And honestly, Busy Bakers, I gotta say, might be my least favorite Looney Tunes cartoon ever. Like, there's nothing to even say about it. It's like a lot of the worst Looney Tunes cartoons I've seen. You can at least say why they're bad. Busy Bakers, you just want to forget about it as soon as you see it. Like,
Their cartoons aren't bad. It's just their style was more along the lines of like the standard 30s cartoon direction that was going on at the time. It's with Hardaway and Dalton, it was more it was their job. It wasn't like Chuck Jones or Clampett or Tashlin where they were trying to improve their artistry by making these shorts. But Hardaway and Dalton did a fine job. A lot of those cartoons are childhood favorites too, like Bars and Stripes Forever and Gold Rush Days. I have a lot of memories with those ones.
Cal Dalton and Ben Hardaway did some good stuff too, like with the Egghead character. I think Aladdin Baghdad is the best one they did, although I think that was a Dalton Howard effort, so Hardaway probably wasn't involved with that. But they didn't make too many cartoons. I'm someone who thinks Earl Duvall should have stayed longer with the studio, because I really like Honeymoon Hotel and Sitting on a Backyard Fence. I think those are some of definitely the best of 34.
Earl Duvall, he had potential, I think. Bernard Brown, I guess music was more his along his liking, but everyone gave it a shot and they really tried hard, even if the cartoons weren't that great some of the time.
The only ones I do like, though, are like the ones where it's really weird and scary and completely what the heck, like A Cartoonist's Nightmare, Fishtails. But I will say that the only thing we can thank these directors for is Bugs Bunny, that general idea of Bugs Bunny, which of course came out of Ben Bugs Hardaway and Cal Dalton.
in many ways, these directors, they didn't always hit the mark, but it's interesting to see what the status of the cartoons was like early on compared to later.
To be fair, the fact that we got any good cartoons from Warner Brothers at all with that heavy production schedule is a miracle in itself. Technically these were low budget cartoons too, which is insane to me.
And that will do it for this episode.
As an answer to a question you didn't ask me,
Oh, okay, Jerry.
what's the one thing I'm looking for?
All right, well, here is a bonus part to this podcast, which is a thank you for all of you being so patient with me making the last two parts of the series. So take it away, Jerry.
Now, I've answered this before online. A lot of people watching probably have heard me say this before. What's the one Warner Brothers cartoon thing that I want? I want to restore the Bugs Bunny show, the 1960, 1962 primetime ABC series intact. Yes, with commercials, but the whole, regardless. Now, you may have seen on the Golden Collections, we did what I call Frankenstein versions, where they're half black and white. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I've seen those. Yep, definitely.
Right. And that's because that's the way at the moment they exist. They don't have complete color elements of the shows. That said, they have 35 millimeter on the black and white. So we were able to make these Frankenstein versions of a couple of the shows that we put on as bonus material. We need to look, we can colorize the black and white, or I very strongly believe that color versions exist. That's a whole other story I don't want to talk about right now, but I believe we could restore them. I believe they could be put back on. And why that hasn't been done, I've been trying to do this for 25 years or more, probably 30 years. Because I remember when the Cartoon Network started, and I started to advocate, why don't we restore that and have the Bugs Bunny show on every night, as a primetime show on Cartoon Network. That was a theory I had way back when. Well, everything they've done ever since, whether it's the DVDs and now HBO Max, and all the other iterations of the Cartoon Network, why they don't restore the Bugs Bunny show, I don't understand. One last thing on that is that around the time of Space Jam, and that's a long time ago now, somebody came to me from the home video department and asked, "Oh, we put out the Stars of Space Jam VHS series, and we put out a special one with Marvin the Martian, and we put out one with the Tasmanian Devil, and those, and they said those are great. They sold really well, and we heard you're the guy to go to. Can you give us the names of the other Tasmanian Devil cartoons and the other Marvin the Martian?" This is before they were making, I think, even Tasmania, the TV series. And I said, "Well, you released all of them." I said, "There's only one thing I can think of. Both characters, or at least Tasmanian Devil, at least off the top of my head, makes a couple of appearances on the Bugs Bunny show, and you have that footage. And it's McKimpson, and it's Mel Blanc, and you've got more footage if you want it, you know." And even then, they wouldn't do it, you know, which I thought was odd. There was some weird resistance to restoring that show, and that's one of my holy grails.
Fantastic.
Keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm happy. I love it when, you know, that's what I do. I like to help people do all these things that I wish I had time to do. I don't have time to do what you're doing, so thank you.
Yeah, well, it was great that you had me on. I'm always here to talk about Warner cartoons again. Just, send me a message and I'll... Oh, sorry, I'm gonna miss the Hobo Gadget Band recital. See you later.
Alright, well, I just want to quickly say thank you, Anthony, for having me. I'm sorry if my answers were a little incorrect here and there, but, you know, I tried my best. Didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare. But quickly, I wanted to also say that... What? Really? Alright, so I gotta get going. The Canadian Hobo Gadget Band needs me because somebody stole the bacon. Gotta go deal with that. You know how popular Canadian bacon is. So I'll have to leave it at that. Have a good one, guys.
Well, guys, this has been a lot of fun, but unfortunately, I got to work on my thesis, so I take good care. Hopefully, I can pay off those student loans on time. But see y'all later.
So, like the Dutch people say, dat was het allemaal, mensen. That's all, folks. Oh, I have to get back to playing the flute.
I'm glad to be here, and I hope to be back again. It appears we filled up most of the picture already. So I've got to say, that's all, folks.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been a fan of the channel for quite some time now, so it's nice to finally make an appearance. And I would stay longer, but I'm afraid I must go back to the Hobo Gadget Band and play with my fellow Hardaway Dalton cartoon dogmen.
So that concludes my first 250 Looney Tunes series, and yes, I will do a series for the next 250, which I will do once a commentary for number 500 comes out, which is for Easter eggs. So make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss out. So thank you so much for, well, A, being patient with all these parts coming out, and B, for listening or watching. So until next time, take care.
Tonight, what heights will he